I'm going to admit something right at the beginning. I had a very different talk kind of in mind for this until Monday. I don't know if you noticed, but some things happened in the United States on Monday that made me realize that the audience might want to hear a slightly different talk than the one I anticipated. So I scrapped that and have kind of come up with a slightly different talk today, and we'll see how it goes. I've not given this one before, so we'll kind of play it by ear. But here we are in January 2025, and I think we'd all agree it's a pretty critical juncture in the issues of climate change. And what I wanted to do today is maybe kind of first take stock and ask, where are we after, overall in the big picture of climate change? And then later, what can we do about that to get back on track? Because I think I'm going to argue we're not really meeting all the goals we should be meeting. But if we're going to take stock, let's first start with the science of where is the planet right now. And I think it's fair to say overall the picture is pretty clear that warming is continuing just as it has been from the late 19th and through the 20th and into the 21st century. We know that increasing CO2 and other greenhouse gases is warming the planet, and by golly, the planet is warming. And we're seeing that, of course, take place decade after decade after decade, continuing on into the 2020s. One of the things you've probably seen a lot in the news in the last couple of weeks, which is actually very bad reporting, is that we've now broken the 1.5 limit on climate change that was set forth by the Paris Agreement. That's not true. Absolutely not true. It's bad science reporting. One year has broken 1.5. Yes, the year 2024 exceeded 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial warming. But the Paris Agreement was about the climate being 1.5 degrees warmer. Climate is different than one individual year. That sounds like a nitpick point, but it's not. It's really important that we stay true to the science, even when it maybe moderates a message, because that's just truth, first of all. But it's also what the Paris Agreement was set out to. The Paris Agreement was trying to keep the world below 2 degrees of warming with a higher level of ambition of maybe closer to 1.5. We're now at about 1.2 to 1.3 by that definition. So let's make sure we keep our facts straight. The reason to do that is we got into this mess because we didn't pay attention to the science, and we're not going to get out of this mess if we ignore science either, regardless of how you might feel about it. So those are just the facts. We have not yet hit 1.5 degrees of climate warming. It's closer to 1.2 to 1.3. That's bad enough. But that's been expected for a long time. This is not novel or surprising to anyone who's been paying attention, and it is part of a longer trend. The planet has been steadily warming, and again, kind of zooming into the last few decades. We can see the comparisons of all the different temperature measurements, the colored lines versus what the models were predicting, which is the black solid line, and that gray area is the range of the prediction uncertainty of climate models. In a bigger context, one thing that has been kind of interesting is that from the 1970s to like 1990, we might have seen kind of one rate of warming. But since about the 1990s or so, the pace of warming may have picked up a little bit. Not very much, but a little bit. And statistically speaking, you could argue that post 1990 warming was slightly faster than pre 1990 warming overall. And when we look for reasons why that is, again, it's not surprising. It's partly due to things like the albedo feedback, climate scientists will call it. When the planet gets warmer, there's going to be less snow, less ice, for example, which reflects the sun's rays and makes the planet actually warm up a little bit faster when we get rid of snow and ice. This was entirely expected, and as you saw, completely within the realm of what models have been predicting for decades now. Another thing that's been clear is that there are certain geographic patterns of warming emerging. Not everywhere is warming by the same amount. So if we look at the kind of temperature changes that have unfolded since the middle of the 19th century, here we see maps of, temperature anomalies, kind of weird blue areas that are colder than normal, red areas that are warmer than normal. By the time you get to the 1990s and 2000s and 2010s, and beyond, we see, very clear overall warming pictures starting to emerge with a lot of variation from year to year. But one of the clear signatures of all this is that the land areas of the world are warming far faster than the oceans, and the northern polar regions are warming fastest of all. Again, this is entirely expected. Land warms up faster than oceans, and the northern polar regions, losing snow and ice, through that albedo feedback I mentioned, is warming faster overall. And again, this is entirely expected. There's been no surprises here at all. And in fact, overall, the warming picture is 100% on track with the models. Again, there's been some kind of hyperbolic media reporting saying we're hitting tipping points and big surprises. And the climate science would have to come back and say, no, we're not. The predictions that we've been making since the 1980s are exactly on track. And there hasn't been really any surprises at all in terms of the larger climate warming picture so far. That doesn't mean it can't happen, and maybe will. But one of the things that has been maybe surprising, especially to most people outside of the climate community, isn't the amount of warming, but the damage that it's doing, the kind of impacts that climate change, even a degree and a half or so of warming, the 1.3 degrees of warming or so, how much is that causing damage around the world? That is catching people maybe by surprise. And it turns out that small increases in temperature, even a little bit of warming, can cause really big increases in the damaging impacts of climate change. And that's because things like the amount of water vapor the air can hold go up exponentially with temperature. Even a little bit of warming can make the atmosphere hold a lot more moisture, making rainstorms and big torrential floods more frequent. But it also makes the air thirstier, what we call the vapor pressure deficit. That means air can suck up more moisture than it ever could before, which makes droughts and other things even worse than before. And it also means that a small change in temperature can show up as very large increases in the extreme weather events, whether it's big storms, more droughts, more floods, and sadly, as we've seen recently, increases in the kind of weather that fires tend to dominate in as well. So even though the warming has been slow, steady, and right on track, the outcomes of a warmer atmosphere are showing up in fairly dramatic ways. And those impacts, not the warming itself, but what the warming causes in terms of day-to-day weather or extreme events, that's catching us maybe by surprise. So we are seeing kind of unprecedented storms, unprecedented fires, and these things are really catching society off guard. And that, I would argue, has been expected, but maybe not by society as a whole. And some of these things are maybe beyond what we predicted in some ways. But overall, the basic patterns were expected, but it's really, really damaging. And the bottom line here is that no matter how you look at this, every bit of warming matters, whether it's from 1.2 degrees to 1.3 to 1.4 to 1.5. And if we exceed 1.5, every tenth of a degree will matter because as we warm, the damages are going to be increasing dramatically. So the world is warming kind of as expected. The damages are definitely starting to show up here, and we are seeing how even small changes in warming can have big outcomes for society. And that's really, really a big, sad part of the story. So that's kind of the warming kind of science of what's happening in the atmosphere. But what's going on with climate action? What are we doing about climate action? And how are we stopping climate change? Well, I'm going to start with some good news because it's kind of seems in short supply a lot of the time, but there is some good news. We are seeing, for example, many climate solutions are accelerating, getting very, very good traction now, mainly because they're getting cheaper. Some technologies, for example, solar photovoltaics, solar panels, are getting really, really, really cheap in terms of their installation cost. What we call their capacity factors are staying very strong. And the cost to produce a unit of energy, what we call the levelized cost of electricity, is getting ridiculously cheap. In fact, solar has dropped in price by about tenfold since 2010. And now solar is the cheapest form of energy, not only in the world today, in all of human history. And it's beating fossil fuels on a level playing field in the market today. So if you need to produce new electricity, solar is always right now the cheapest way to do it, and it's only getting cheaper. So that's great. And things like solar are getting out there in the world thanks to the markets, thanks to technology, and they're growing faster than anybody ever predicted before. And that's really good news. So we're seeing, again and again and again, our forecast of what solar can do are beat by reality. We're always too pessimistic about solar. It's just really doing incredibly well and beating the historical forecast again and again and again. So this, I would argue, is a real tipping point. We haven't seen a tipping point in warming, but we have seen tipping points in technologies. Solar has hit those for sure, as are things like batteries, heat pumps, electric vehicles, and so on. Thanks to technology, engineering, markets, and finally hitting these kind of social and economic tipping points, we have some success stories to really celebrate right now around climate change in terms of what's possible. The success stories, though, have been mostly the smaller, more modular technologies like solar panels, heat pumps, batteries, LED lights, um, electric vehicles, things like that. Those are getting better, cheaper, faster than anybody's really ever predicted. And we can thank the role of markets and technology in investments by governments, but also the private sector in making some of this happen. And I know it doesn't seem like it, especially in light of the news this week, but there are other success stories all over the world. And this is one I just saw posted yesterday, actually, by the CEO of Gurun Energy, Assad Rozak. And this is just success stories in the last week that have happened around the world that we don't hear about. For example, electric vehicle sales increased 25% last year to a whole new record. We also see big movements in kind of cutting emissions in shipping fleets. Huge movement in China, which is now by far the world's biggest emitter at about 30% of global emissions. The US is around 10. So China is really a big deal, and they've now hit peak oil. They have their first energy laws. They're about to spend 90 billion, about 3 times the Inflation Reduction Act, on green kind of energy technologies this year alone. And they're about to build a 1 kilometer wide solar array in space, which is kind of interesting. We also see some kind of good news this week in the EU, also in the UK, and yes, even in the US, that the Supreme Court declined requests from oil and gas companies to dismiss lawsuits brought mainly by youth groups against them. And the Supreme Court declined that. And so those court cases will go forward. So, despite all the horrible things we've been hearing this week on climate change, there is still some good news. And I just want to remind people of that. But yes, there is bad news too, and we need to face it squarely and look at it and see how we can figure it out. And frankly, there've just been too many failures. And I think the failures are coming in a lot of different flavors, but one of them is the rise of disinformation. This, in the near term, may be much more important than climate change, because I don't know how you can solve climate change or anything else if we're just constantly being lied to. And the rise of just disinformation has become a multi-billion-dollar business, and it's designed to create power and profits in certain sectors. Media outlets, tech companies, politicians, and so on are basically in cahoots to lie to us and use huge, powerful tools to peddle disinformation and misinformation all around the world. And I think we're seeing that. It's affecting elections, it's affecting policy, it's affecting the economy. This is incredibly, incredibly dangerous and definitely affects what we're seeing in climate change as well. So this is a failure of critical institutions we need in the world today. And we need to think about that very, very hard. I also feel like we've seen major failures, especially in the last few years, of our international diplomatic efforts. We have set up a process to discuss and negotiate climate agreements around the world called the COP meetings. You've undoubtedly heard of these. COP stands for Conference of Parties, just a fancy word for a summit, a conference. And it's basically, we had the COP28 in the UAE and COP29 in Azerbaijan. These were, well, let's admit it, these were miserable failures. They became basically a farce. The host countries themselves are major oil producers. These meetings were completely and utterly co-opted by special interest from fossil fuels, big agriculture, and others, and little real concrete work came out of them. Some things, but not nearly at the rate we need in the world today. We also, I think, are seeing a failure of spending what little we spend on climate solutions, often in the wrong places. We have politics and special interest in feel-good solutions devouring huge amounts of money, time, and attention, and these solutions just don't work, like carbon capture technologies, some parts of regenerative agriculture, fusion, other things that are kind of distracting us and pulling billions of dollars away from things we know do work into things that are nonsensical solutions that don't work, that are just appeasing special interest and pulling money out of good things. And a lot of it is in the guise of greenwashing. So we have to call that out as well. And finally, this week, I think it's pretty clear that US federal leadership on climate, what little we've ever seen in the first place, and I'm going to tell you pretty soon, we never really saw that much. But what little we had is kind of collapsing before our very eyes, and literally in the last few days. And this is pretty clear why. President Trump has spent most of the last 20 years spreading disinformation about climate change. He is not a fan. He believes I don't know what he believes. I just know what he says. He thinks it's a hoax or a thing that China is trying to pull off in the world or whatever, whatever. And apparently, if it's cold outside of his Trump Tower in New York, that doesn't mean warming is happening elsewhere in the world, whatever. But, he's spreading a lot of nonsense around climate change, and we've all seen that. And during the election, he vowed to promote fossil fuels, repeal some of the hard won kind of investments and common sense environmental laws that we've made in the last few years. And yep, he followed through on it. I guess we should have believed one thing he said. He actually did do what he said. That on Monday, he signed executive orders instructing us to leave the Paris agreements, the Paris Accords, and also did a number of executive orders that are really pushing fossil fuel production, declaring a so-called energy emergency, even though the United States is producing more oil and gas than any other country in the world today. He thinks that that's an energy emergency somehow, which is nonsense, but it's going to have big implications for policy. Also signed executive orders kind of dismantling wind projects around the country, and another executive order putting a pause on investments through the Inflation Reduction Act. That may or may not be legal. Some people are questioning whether he has the authority to do that. I don't, being legal or not never stopped Trump before, but we'll see how this goes. And we're going to be obviously all watching this very, very much. But how much does the Trump 2.0 effect really matter? Well, that's an interesting question because here's what the science tells us. This is what US emissions have looked like over the last few years. From about, let's say 2007 to 2020 something, emissions in the US kept going down at about the same rate. And it didn't matter who was president, it turns out. That peak emissions in the US were in 2007, and now they're about 22% below that. And that was through the Obama administration, the first Trump administration, and the Biden administration, that we were slowly but steadily kind of dropping US emissions thanks to moving away from coal, some technology improvements, some other things we can talk about in more detail later. We basically didn't see the role of federal policy here yet. Biden's efforts came towards the very end of this curve, and we're going to take a little while to kick in. And we had no federal leadership until the last few years of the Biden administration. So the question isn't what has happened, the question is what could happen. And different estimates were showing as the Inflation Reduction Act, as the CHIPS Act, and other Biden investments were starting to kick in, the rate of decline of US emissions should be accelerating into the future. And so the question is, do we go back to the blue curve or do we move to the orange curve? The orange curves are what should have happened if the Biden administration's policies kept going. We'd see continued reductions and those would accelerate. But we may come back to a world that pulls back from that a little bit. I doubt very much emissions in the US will increase again, but they may not drop at the rate that is needed and the rate that we hope for. So it is a mixed problem. I believe that Trump can definitely slow progress on climate change in the United States. The US is about 10% of the world's emissions, so the other 90% is at least directly not so much affected by Trump's actions. But he can definitely slow down progress here, and that will have a domino effect across the world too. It's not everything, but it's very, very important. And some of the progress, most of the progress we have been seeing in the US and elsewhere wasn't due to the White House anyway. It was mostly technology and markets. So we see a complex picture here where Trump is definitely throwing a monkey wrench into climate action in the United States, but it's not entirely lost. We have other fronts to work on, and I'll talk about that later, but it is definitely not good, and it's definitely slowing down what could have been tremendous progress. So overall on climate progress, I would say it's kind of a mixed bag, like probably everything. We see some good news. Things are getting cheaper, faster, and getting adopted better than we ever thought. And some bad news. The political leadership in the international stage and at the US national federal stage is not meeting the moment at all. In fact, maybe sliding backwards. And overall, the grade would have to be not very good because we are still, even though there is some progress, overall, we are falling behind what is necessary to address climate change and meet the Paris Agreement. It's not that we're not making progress, we're just not making it fast enough, and political leadership at the international level and the US domestic level are laughably far behind what it would be helpful. So it is a big mixed picture and overall probably looks a little bit grim. So how can we move forward? And that's really what I want to talk about today, not just taking stock, but now looking forward. What can we do about this? First, I want to talk about more strategic approaches to addressing climate change because as a scientist, I really feel we're not doing the best possible job. Even before Trump came back to office, before the big political failures of COP, even at the best of times, we were often wasting our money, our time, and our effort not doing the smartest possible things. It wasn't just about more climate funding and more climate action. We need smarter climate action. We need climate action that actually follows the science, is much more strategic. And we have not done that very well. For example, we really do need to invest in the most effective solutions, not distractions, not greenwashing, and not promised high-tech solutions that might someday arrive. We have to talk about solutions that are effective now. And Drawdown has been talking about these for years. We catalog and document very carefully all the time what are the most effective, viable solutions today in electricity, in food, in transport, and all around the world. And you'll see on this graph, you will not see the words carbon capture. It's not effective at all. It's a total waste of time and money and actually emits more greenhouse gases than it can absorb. We don't list corn ethanol. We don't list a lot of things on here that are not real climate solutions. And at Drawdown, maybe we need to do a better job of calling out these non-solutions that gobble up billions of dollars and take away time and effort and talent from things that actually do work. Usually we just talked about what does work. We need to shine a spotlight on the BS that doesn't, because it's been taking way too much attention away from the things that work. We also should not only focus on the effective solutions, but also the least expensive to get the biggest bang for the buck and with the least resistance. Fortunately, again, we can catalog time and time again which solutions are cost effective. All the climate solutions below this line in the green area turn out to be cheaper than running the world on fossil fuels or unsustainable agriculture or polluting industries. 80% of the time, Drawdown's climate solutions are actually cheaper than the way we do things now. So those are good things. Let's focus on effective and affordable climate solutions, and they're here in abundance. And one thing I'll promise you is Drawdown's going to be saying a lot more about the nonsense, distracting non-solutions to climate change that unfortunately we've been seeing way too much of lately. But here's where we also could be more strategic. We got to focus a lot more on the fast solutions, not only effective and cheap, but fast. Because we're in a race against time. We have to bring the world to net zero by about 2050. We can't do it in the last year of 2049 because it's the cumulative action that we have to worry about, not what we do in 1 year, but the total amount of pollution we emit between now and mid-century. And so bending the curve now, this coming decade or so, can avoid a whole bunch of pollution from going into the atmosphere and keep doing it and keep doing it. But the earlier we act, the more impact we can have. And so the first thing we have to realize is that cutting emissions is most of the game. Carbon removal is not an approach to getting to climate solutions in the next couple of decades. Maybe later in the century, but right now, 96% of what we have to do is cut the bloody emissions. And most of it we have to do now in the first decade or so to really stay on track. And that means there's kind of a time value of carbon. The early investments we make now pay off year after year after year after year. Every year you wait for some new climate solution to arrive, like carbon capture, fusion, whatever, these science fiction kind of magical thinking solutions, is a year we've wasted. It's a year we put more pollution in the atmosphere, locking in additional warming. We cannot afford delay. So don't wait. Implement what we have now. Even more important is implementing now is implementing the fastest of the fast solutions. What at Drawdown, we kind of coined this phrase for climate action of pulling the emergency brakes on climate. And what does that mean? What are the emergency brakes on climate change? Well, there's a little science here that's really important. It turns out some climate solutions, especially those that work on particular gases, can have a very strong warming effect in the near term that are kind of faster climate change agents than others, but they don't last as long. Let me show you kind of what I mean. If we look at what we emit in the atmosphere just this year, let's say we look at the year 2025 and we track all of the CO2, all of the methane, all of the black carbon, all the carbon monoxide, nitrous oxide, all the greenhouse gas pollution we put into the atmosphere this year, in just 1 year, and we ask how much does it affect the atmosphere for the next 50, 100, 200 years into the future, it looks something like this. So this is the effect on the planet of just 1 year's CO2 emissions. If we just look at the CO2 we emit this year, this is how it will warm the planet. It will warm the planet about 20 to 25 millikelvins. That's a fancy word which basically means a thousandth of a degree. So it means about 20 to 30 thousandths of a degree Celsius warmer because of just 1 year's CO2 emissions. Then we can add the nitrous oxide, another greenhouse gas. We can add carbon monoxide, a greenhouse gas that also affects warming over the next decades and lasts a very long time. But then let's look at the next two greenhouse gases, methane and black carbon. Those curves have a kind of a different shape. They warm a lot in the first decade or two and then quickly go away by year 40 or 50. So when it comes to climate change, it turns out we can kind of look at two different flavors of greenhouse gases. The long-lived greenhouse warming agents like carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, but these other gases, especially methane and what we call black carbon, those are short-lived. They wallop a big warming punch in a decade or two, but then they basically go away after 40 or 50 years. By focusing more attention on the short-lived climate pollution, we might have a bit of an emergency brake there. If we focus a lot more attention on methane, on black carbon, and a few other things, maybe we can kind of get a faster climate solution than only focusing on CO2. Now, of course, we got to do all of this, but maybe we could shift the ratio of how much we focus on methane versus CO2 to kind of help us get back on track. It's a way of kind of catching up for lost time because this is a faster solution than focusing only on CO2. Another kind of emergency brake is avoiding large pulses of emissions where suddenly a whole bunch of greenhouse gas pollution goes into the atmosphere all at once, not slowly and steadily like a gas power plant. One of those opportunities is avoiding deforestation. It turns out deforestation, which is about 12% of greenhouse gas emissions today, more than the entire United States, comes from deforestation. That is, all like tropical deforestation emits more greenhouse gases than the US economy. But we don't talk about it nearly as much, and hardly any funding goes to stopping deforestation. But if we stop deforestation, the impacts are felt on day one. If you stop burning down the Amazon, all that carbon never got emitted in the first place. It's the fastest climate solution of all because it never even happened if you stop burning down the forest. So that's why at Drawdown, we're focusing a lot of time and attention on the so-called emergency brakes. How do we bend the curve rapidly, making up for some lost time? And they're going to be solutions focusing on methane, on black carbon, and on deforestation in particular. These are the fastest of the fast climate solutions. Then we focus on the more traditional solutions like revolving infrastructure, switching out our power plants, electric vehicles, and so on and so on and so on. That's going to take a little bit longer. Then we have nature-based solutions that build back soil carbon, replanting trees, things like that. That takes even longer than that because it's about 2 to 3 decades before carbon builds back up in soils and vegetation. And then slowest of all might be the new arrivals of technology and also the riskiest solutions because 99% of those will never arrive. So let's pull the emergency brakes now. Then in parallel, we build out infrastructure, and in parallel, we invest in nature. And yes, in parallel, we continue R&D spending on new technologies. But let's get the portfolio right. Let's spend way more money and time and attention on the emergency brakes and maybe a lot less on science fiction projects. That could get us back on track. focusing on time. We also can focus a lot more on geography, pinpointing the exact location of where our efforts could do the most good. For example, this is some older data here, but it's showing the greenhouse gas emitted by power plants all over the world. The red dots are the power plants that are the dirtiest. They emit more carbon, more pollution per unit of energy than the yellow ones, and far more than the green ones. So can we maybe focus our efforts of getting rid of the dirtiest of the dirty power plants in the world, the low-hanging fruits, maybe the dirtiest coal power plants still left, or even the dirty gas power plants, and so on. We can also pinpoint now with satellites, and these are great new data sets that are beginning to emerge. We can pinpoint like methane emissions from refineries or leaking pipelines or abandoned wells and know exactly where to go with our actions. Instead of looking everywhere evenly all at once, let's pinpoint the 80-20 rules, the places where maybe 80% of the climate emissions come from 20% of the places. Let's focus on the worst, biggest polluters of all and just work our way down. We can also do this now with increasingly detailed geographic information from satellites, from big data, even using machine learning to help us kind of pinpoint these places, but looking at the trade-offs in agriculture between food production and clearing forest. We have an exciting new project at Project Drawdown focusing on Southeast Asia right now, pinpointing key areas of where deforestation is happening across Southeast Asia, in particular where those deforestation events are happening on peatland soils in green, where burning these forests not only removes the forest carbon, but also burns a whole bunch of the carbon in peatland soils. Those are the worst of the worst places to deforest. And then we can pinpoint why we're losing the forest, in the most part for big commodity agriculture, like palm oil, for example, but other things too. We can also pinpoint interventions around the world where we can cut over excessive uses of fertilizers. Again, this shows like in the red and brown areas, places where we're overusing fertilizers that emit nitrous oxide, a powerful greenhouse gas, but the green areas are just fine. So we have to kind of pinpoint these areas. And again, zooming into Southeast Asia, we can look particularly in maybe parts of Thailand or Java, where there could be improved nutrient management, where changing the way we use fertilizers could have a big targeted impact on climate change. So now, thanks to big data, we can find really good ways to pinpoint our efforts geographically down to the pixel and know exactly where to intervene to get the biggest bang for the buck. Daria mentioned before a new project we have called the Drawdown Explorer, which will be launching in June, which will produce for all climate solutions eventually detailed geographic maps of where we should intervene to have the biggest impact for the least investment. Really surgically pinpointing climate actions, not only in time, but in space, to be much more effective than anything we've ever seen before. And also, we have to think about how climate solutions can do more than just reduce greenhouse gases, how they can affect air pollution and improve human health around the world, how climate solutions can also unlock the keys to alleviating poverty, improving income and work opportunities and jobs, improving equality and education and material benefits to energy, water, housing, and so on. This is showing some work we've done looking at how climate solutions in developing countries and countries earning less than $2 a day per capita, how climate solutions can help unlock tremendous benefits, alleviating poverty, improving human well-being, improving security, improving health, and equality and equity around the world. So in summary, we can take far more effective approaches instead of just throwing money at everything. And a lot of the times that's corrupted by special interest or greenwashing. How do we bring it back to the most effective solutions that are the least expensive, that are get it out of the gate the fastest, that are targeted to the most precise places to be most effective, and offer multiple benefits, not just to climate change, but to people and societies around the world? Fortunately, the science is now here, and Drawdown's going to be spending a lot more time and energy providing these tools and these guidance kind of tools for the world to be far more effective in its climate action. So we can up our game and be more effective with climate action than ever before by using data and science to guide us. That's going to be very important. But I also think we need to reboot our leadership models. We've basically kind of abdicated too much leadership to like the UN and to Washington, D.C. And let's be honest, they're failing us. Federal policy and international diplomacy are not getting the job done by themselves. They are important, and we should never relent on trying to get them to be effective. But them alone are not going to be enough to get the job done. So if we're looking at the entire board of action, policymakers at the federal and international level can do important things. They can set high aspirational goals like the Paris Accords. They can affect rules and policies around the world. Absolutely. But there are other players and there are other tactics. Why just look at policymaking alone when we can also look at what business can do? Investors, philanthropists, tech communities, practitioners in the real world of deploying these solutions, civil society leaders, cultural leaders, communities, and even, yes, us at the individual and household level, we can do so much. Maybe not just in policy and setting goals, but also in where our money goes, where our people and effort goes, how businesses behave, how individuals behave, and what kinds of tech companies do we want and reward, and what kinds of investments in the future should we be making. So instead of just leaving everything in those one or two corners of this larger board of only the policymakers of the UN and the White House get to rule the world, and just through policy, that's a very narrow telescope view of how we can change the world. It's a much bigger field. And I keep on reminding myself of chess and the expression of seeing the whole board, right? And we have to learn how to see and play the entire chessboard now. And if one key part of your chess game fails, you lose a rook, you adapt and you keep playing with the bishop now. You play with other pieces. And if the UN and US federal leadership falls behind, which let's be honest, they are, what can we do through cities and states, through civil society, through activism, through technology and engineering, and through entrepreneurship with businesses, investors, and so on? If a tactic fails, adapt, keep playing. Try and set up policy making through Washington. What can we do with technology, with markets, with business behavior, culture, investing, philanthropy? Let's learn how to play the whole board. And that's something we have to do to be more effective and have a much more expansive view of climate leadership than just through a few elected officials. That has failed us. So yes, we do need to take stock today here in 2025, and the picture is mixed. It isn't what we hoped for. It's some good stuff, some bad stuff. But moving forward, I really do think we have an opportunity here to reboot what we're doing for climate change. It is not a time to give up at all. It's time to redouble our efforts, I think, and focus with much more strategic approaches, using science to help us identify what is the most effective climate solution, not the greenwashing thing we want to get distracted by. What are the cheapest climate solutions so we can get more for our money and get more deployed now? How can we implement the fastest climate solutions that start to affect the atmosphere now, not a Bill Gates solution that shows up maybe later in the century, but something that's here tangible today? How do we put them in exactly the right places to have the biggest impact in the shortest amount of time in the most effective ways? And how do we get multiple benefits from our climate solutions that help people and the climate at the same time? And also, it's pretty clear we can't rely on Washington or the UN to save us. Not entirely. We don't walk away from them, but maybe we mix the model of our model of leadership a little bit differently and focus on what we can do in other ways through cities and states, through business, through investment, through philanthropy, through culture, through activism, through everything. And we're going to have to learn as we go. We don't have time to study this. We're going to have to try and adapt when we fail, get up and try again. But along the way, we can never, ever waver in our commitment to stopping climate change. We must never give up. And I would argue, too, that the future is a choice, and this is absolutely not the moment to choose apathy or just giving up or running up the white flag and saying it's too late and we can't do anything for 4 years because of one guy getting in the White House. Absolutely not. The future is a choice. Adapt. Pick up yourself up off the mat. Let's move forward with the other tools we have. We have so many different tools, so many different tactics to be smarter with climate action, to be more effective with climate action, and with new and more effective climate leaders. So let's choose the future we want. Let's make a good choice and let's get to work. and see how we can take a rebooted approach to climate solutions and move forward. The opportunities are endless. So with that, I'll stop here, and I know we have some time for a Q&A and conversation, which should be a lot of fun. So I'll invite my colleagues here to join in this, and I'm sure we'll have a very provocative conversation here because there's a lot going on in the world and lots of different views on this. So I look forward to having a lively conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, John. That was fantastic and great to hear given this week. But we've got a lot of amazing questions coming in. I will start with one. Could you talk through the factors that contributed to solar getting cheaper and how that can be replicated for other solutions potentially?
Yeah, there's a great book all about this called Why Solar Got Cheap by Greg Nemeth at the University of Wisconsin. He's a professor of public policy there. Highly recommend it. And I can't do justice to his complete argument, but I mean, it happened in a few different stages. It happened first through smart investments in research and development in primarily the United States. So Bell Labs invented the first kind of commercial solar panels back in the 1950s. Private investment back when the private sector invested in real R&D, not just apps, real things. So that was Bell Labs. And then NASA using it for the early days of the space program in the US. And again, solar was wildly expensive, but it's the only thing we could use for the burgeoning space program of the 60s and 70s. So that kind of government investment early on in early R&D phases was crucial. And then the German government later using solar with policy, even though it was still very expensive, policy in Germany at the time kind of saying, hey, we should do something about energy independence and climate change and whatnot. They put money into solar, so it kind of kept it alive commercially. But it wasn't competitive with fossil fuels, not even close. It's only after the US, then Germany, it was China that made the big breakthrough. When China started producing solar at scales that were unprecedented, just literally printing by the gazillions solar panels, did we achieve those economies of scale? And that's where climate solutions work best. It's when they can be mass produced, like iPhones or something. And often that means international production and consumption. Maybe it's made in China or somewhere else and then built in the United States or Norway or Germany or someplace by just putting it together. So these kind of smaller modular climate solutions, things like batteries, LED lights, heat pumps, electric vehicle components, solar panels, these are climate solutions that have very steep cost curves. That means they get cheaper very, very quickly. Big, huge government projects, though, like a nuclear power plant, a light rail system, new high-speed rail, things like that, never get cheaper. In fact, they only get more expensive in Western Europe, the United States, and so on, because they tend to get corrupt with, consultants and lawyers and everybody with their hand out. They get very expensive. They have cost overruns. So billion-dollar kind of big public projects tend to be slow and expensive. Small modular things you can build in one place and reassemble in another tend to be very cheap and get these economies of scale very quickly. So think, things like this. You want climate solutions that scale like an iPhone. Otherwise, we will not make it in time.
Thanks, John. We had a couple questions about how Indigenous peoples' stewardship of natural ecosystems can be recognized and recognized as a critical solution for maintaining biogenic carbon capture, specifically related to deforestation.
Oh, amen. In fact, from day one in Drawdown, we've recognized the importance of indigenous communities, especially through land rights and land tenure. Having the legal rights to land is a crucial climate solution. So backing up, a lot of people don't really appreciate how important deforestation is as a climate problem. Again, about 12% of the world's current emissions come from deforestation, mainly in the tropics, in the Amazon, around the Congo Basin in West Africa, and through the Indonesian archipelago mostly. And of all the things we've tried to stop deforestation, like making parks, carbon credit projects, carbon offset projects, those work kind of, but the best solution is working with local indigenous communities, most of all, and helping them kind of keep their land and help, even they might use it in different ways. Maybe it's not entirely intact and 100%, but working with local communities has been by far the most effective way to preserve things like rainforest and these incredibly biodiverse, rich regions, but also regions rich in carbon. And so, yeah, working with indigenous communities is probably one of the best climate solutions out there and is wildly underfunded. If we could take the money we're throwing at carbon capture projects in the US budget and throw it at deforestation instead, oh my God, it'd be a game changer. But that's not going to happen right now. I would actually point people, we had a deep dive event a couple of weeks ago, a couple of months ago now on deforestation. And maybe we could put that in the chat. There are some links to videos there and some materials. But there's an organization called forestpeopleclimate.org that we work with quite closely that has identified some really important strategies on how to really work with people around the world to limit deforestation. And one of the principal ways is working with local and indigenous communities across the world. Turns out to be a really effective solution. And it's not just a feel good kind of human story. There's real science there showing again and again and again with data that indigenous communities preserve their forests better than their neighbors. And those forests are richer in biodiversity and richer in carbon than their neighbors. Maybe they're onto something. So I think that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. And sometimes we have to move away from purely technocratic solutions into looking at solutions that do involve people, and often people who don't have the same voices as an Elon Musk may have out there in the world. There's a lot of wisdom and good approaches there.
What are some ways to widen the bipartisan circle of climate knowledge, concern, and hope for the future?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I assume that's a US kind of centered question, but maybe it applies to other countries as well. If you listen to the politicians, you would think that, Republicans don't believe climate change is even real, let alone a priority. And Democrats all believe it is a priority or something. That's what the TV and Twitter and everything else is trying to tell us. Turns out that's not true. If you actually meet real people in the world and talk to Republicans and Democrats out in the world, they basically all agree about 80 to 90% that climate change is real and maybe we should do something about it. But the approach to that differs. Maybe people who are on the more conservative end of the spectrum, maybe their priorities are a little different and they don't really trust the government to regulate the way but they're fine with private investment and business doing it. Maybe liberals kind of view the world a little different, want government to lead, not business. Okay. But at the end of the day, if we can show how public-private partnerships, and I have to give Biden a lot of credit for this, calling this the Inflation Reduction Act and talking about the benefits to jobs and to rural communities. And the Inflation Reduction Act is spending most of its money in red counties in America, creating jobs that can't be outsourced, creating jobs that AI can't do. And it's been a huge benefit to rural communities and other places that needed economic investment. And it has tremendous climate benefits too. So I think if we talk more about jobs and health and tangible benefits, these so-called co-benefits of climate action, to many people, those are the primary benefits of climate action is, hey, this created jobs in my hometown. It cleaned up the air, it cleaned up the water, it created things that the community can thrive with. And I live right now in a very rural part of Minnesota that's heavily Republican. And when I talk about climate change, it's like 65% of my neighbors voted for Trump. I have no problem talking about climate change here at all, because I talk about jobs. I talk about rural communities that otherwise would be dying, but for these kinds of investments in things like wind and solar, advanced biofuels, and so on. And people get it. Like, sure, that makes sense to me. But what you don't want to do is scold people and just assume all Republicans are like the clowns we see on television. They're not. And don't confuse elected officials who are posturing on TV and trying to win Trump's approval with real people in the real world. We're not as divided as we're being told, not even close. The politicians and social media try to divide us. Let's remember that we're actually not that divided. And most people have some common sense. Although, yeah, more honey than vinegar. Somebody posted in the chat.
Yeah,
Amen.
I was actually just about to repeat that as well.
Yeah.
We definitely are more honey than vinegar.
Well,
But
again, the politicians and the media have one agenda. How about we ignore them for a couple of days and talk to our neighbors? You might find out that we're maybe not as divided as we thought we were, and certainly not as divided as we're told we are. Most people love their kids. Most people want a thriving community. Most people want a better future. And guess what? Climate solutions are really essential for doing all of those things.
Okay, so we have time for just a couple more. We will go with how important is reducing consumption to the overall emissions picture? And as a bit of a follow-up, what is the role of economic growth and its relationship to energy and emissions?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because I think we need to focus a lot more on the quality of our goods and services, not just the quantity of them, and especially the quantity of energy it takes to produce them. Just take like an average vehicle, like a gasoline-powered internal combustion engine wastes about 90% of its energy that's in the gasoline into heat that's radiating, our old cars have things called radiators to just get rid of the excess heat that they produce that's not turned into forward motion on the wheels that make you go where you want to go. An electric vehicle actually is about 90% of the energy in the battery goes into moving the car down the road. In a gas power car, it's 10%. So we can achieve like a 900% improvement in efficiency by still having a car. It doesn't mean giving up mobility, giving up getting around the service of transportation. You don't have to give that up, but you can dramatically reduce how much stuff we're consuming to provide the same service. So I think there's a little nuance here. I think there's huge opportunities of kind of producing the same kinds of goods and services, especially high quality services like healthcare, transportation, the freedom of mobility, clothing, shelter, food, energy, things that people need and want. I think that's good. But we can do that in ways that are far less consuming and wasteful than they do now. We don't have to throw everything away. We could have a more circular economy. We don't have to be so wasteful burning fossil fuels when electrification is far more efficient. So it isn't sacrificing a damn thing to heat your home with a heat pump that's far more efficient, or using an electric vehicle that's far more efficient to have the same goods and services provided to you. Your life is good or better. And you didn't give up a damn thing except a bunch of wasteful practices. But we keep going, and you get into the realm of what some people call degrowth, which I think is just a bad messaging, but maybe good ideas behind it of like, hey, can we maintain a higher quality of life without all the wasteful consumption, without all the wasteful practices where we just throw away everything from energy to stuff all the time? I'm sympathetic to that. I think we need to think about how we message that. That phrase may not be that appealing, but the idea of better quality and higher quality of life, not quantity of stuff, I think that can appeal to people. And measuring real human progress instead of just the dollars moving through the economy would be helpful. But that's a bigger, more philosophical conversation we have to have as a society about like, hey, what really matters? And I don't think a message of sacrifice, like, oh, we have to give up hard-won benefits to human well-being and comfort and security and health. No, absolutely not. Climate solutions can actually improve all those things and do that in ways that are less wasteful, less polluting, and less damaging and less inequitable to the world. I think we can reimagine a very different kind of economy where we live far better lives than we've ever seen before. But we got to have that conversation in ways that can be heard. And right now it's a little fraught, let's say. But yeah, I think kind of consuming less stuff, but maintaining the high quality of life we'd like to have is entirely doable. Mainly because we're so damn inefficient now. There's so many things we could just be, I mean, I honestly think about a third of solving climate change is stop doing stupid things. Like we throw away 40% of the food in the world, don't even eat it. 90% of the energy in a gallon of gasoline doesn't move our car at all. Our homes are leaky and inefficient, our buildings are a joke. We could be so much smarter with the precious resources this planet provides us and live a really abundant and joyful life. We just have to be smarter about it. It's not giving up a damn thing except waste. We can totally do that.
Well, thanks, John. We're about at time. We appreciate all of these amazing questions. Sorry we can't get to all of them, and I definitely see some more technical and specific ones in there. So stay tuned for our future briefings where we'll get more into the weeds on some of these really specific solutions. But as we're wrapping up, do you have one major takeaway from this conversation that you want folks to hear, John?
Well, it sounds like a steady drumbeat, and Drawdown has said this again and again and again and again. But in times like this, I would recommend people remember that the media and our politicians are in the business of scaring us, dividing us, and lying to us. So don't believe everything you see. A lot of it is true, but there's a lot of other sides of the story out there that you're not hearing. There is stuff, good stuff happening in the world alongside all the terrible stuff we see on our damn screens every day. I get to remind myself of that every day too. To get off of our screens and look around to our neighbors once in a while can help restore a bit of balance of perspective of what's really happening in the world, not just what did Trump tweet today? Oh my God, or what terrible thing has Elon Musk done again today? That can be a giant suck of our energy and our time, and I refuse to concede my life's energy to all that stuff. I don't know if that's helpful or not. But the other thing we say at Drawdown a lot is like it is not game over on climate change. It's just barely begun. It's game on. We have to redouble our efforts, get a hell of a lot smarter and a lot more to practical in climate action now than we've ever been. So I would encourage people if you're feeling a little bit down right now, understandable. I get it. Take some time, be good to yourself, gentle to yourself, but then please get off the mat. We need you. We need all of us to link arms, be shoulder to shoulder, and go get this stuff done because we can't count on the elected officials or our old institutions to do it for us. The big, don't believe in that invisible hand anymore. The hands that are going to change the world are right in front of you. That's what we need is we need to all get up off the mat and see ourselves as climate leaders, not some faraway elected official or tech bro. We have to do this ourselves at all levels, from the neighborhood to the UN, everywhere in between, with every lever at our disposal. And we can totally do that. So it's not game over, it's game on. That's the bottom line of what we are today. So don't give up.
Amen. Well, thank you everyone for taking the time today. We will be sending out a recording and the links that we posted in the chat in the next few days, so you can watch us back. And we look forward to seeing you in the coming briefings.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.